All right, I think we're ready to go now. So welcome everybody to this open session, the Standing Committee, and also the Dietary Reference Intake for Energy Committee. I'd like everybody, I'll call you out and just identify your full name and your affiliation. We'll start off with the Standing Committee. If you're here, just jump in, Dr. Greenwood. We'll move on. I saw Stephanie. Would you?
Good morning. Stephanie Atkinson from McMaster University, Department of Pediatrics, and also Biochemistry and Biomedical Sciences.
Thank you. Dr. Das.
That's from the Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University. Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Herring.
Amy Herring from Statistical Science and the Duke Global Health Institute, Duke University.
Thank you. Dr. Krebs.
Good morning. I'm Nancy Krebs, University of Colorado School of Medicine, Department of Pediatrics.
Dr. Lichtenstein.
Hi, good morning. Jean Mayer, USDA Human Nutrition Research Center on Aging at Tufts University and the Friedman School, also at Tufts University.
Nadine, I saw you.
Yes, I'm Nadine Sahyun from the University of Maryland College Park in the Department of Nutrition and Food Science.
Valerie, you here?
I'm Valerie Tarasik from Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto.
Thank you, Valerie. Dr. Van Horn. Here yet. I know she'll be on. Dr. Yetley.
Beth Yetley, retired NIH.
Anna Marie. Maria, I saw you.
Hi, Anna Maria Ciagaris from UMass Amherst.
Dr. Bailey.
Reagan Bailey, Institute for Advancing Health Through Agriculture at Texas A&M University.
Thank you. Dr. Balk.
Hi, Ethan Balk. I'm at the Brown University School of Public Health, and I'm a systematic review methodologist.
Thank you. Dr. Barr.
Good morning, Susan Barr, Human Nutrition at the University of British Columbia.
Thank you. Dr. Carr. Okay, I don't see Dr. Carr. Dr. Butte.
I retired from the Children's Nutrition Research Center at Baylor College of Medicine, Department of Pediatrics.
Dr. Crowder.
Scott Crowder. I'm in the Department of Kinesiology at University of Tennessee, Knoxville.
Dr. Luke.
Hi, Amy Luke at Public Health at Loyola University, Chicago.
Dr. Roberts.
Good morning, Susan Roberts from the USDA Nutrition Center and the Friedman Nutrition School at Tufts University.
Dr. Silver.
Hello, I'm Heidi Silver from the Department of Medicine and Division of Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition at Vanderbilt University Medical Center.
Dr. Tooze. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
That's right, Janet Tews. I'm in the Department of Biostatistics and Data Science at Wake Forest School of Medicine.
And Dr. Wong. Don't see him, and Dr. Yetley's on both committees. So again, thank you so much for attending today and making the time for our committee discussion. The meeting objectives are as follows: to summarize the discussion of topics from the previous joint meeting, discuss healthy population questions with a committee of DRIs for energy, and review letter report and next steps. I do have a statement from the chair that I need to read. So here it goes. As chair of the study and of this committee, I'd like to welcome everybody to this information gathering session. Task being undertaken by this committee of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine is to assess human requirements for energy intake and energy expenditure. This meeting is being held to gather information to help the committee conduct its study. That is, the committee is in the process of assembling materials that it will examine and discuss in the course of making its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Therefore, I ask everyone here today to be mindful of the fact that the committee has made no conclusions and that it would be a mistake for anyone to leave here today thinking otherwise. Comments made by individuals, including members of the committee, should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the National Academies. In addition, committee members typically ask probing questions in the information gathering sessions that may or may not be indicative of their personal views. Committee will deliberate thoroughly before writing its report. Moreover, once a draft report is written, it must go through a rigorous review by experts who are anonymous to the committee, and the committee must respond to the review with appropriate revisions that adequately satisfy the National Academy's Report Review Committee and an NAS president before it is considered as an official Academy's report. So now I wanted to just very, very quickly summarize the outcomes of our previous meeting. I think everybody has received this in writing. So we were provided with 6 major questions from our sponsors, the federal sponsors, some of whom were on the call today. Those questions surround the issue of BMI and use of BMI cut points, particularly related to the committee, DRI Committee on Energy. Should cut points be used, for example? There was discussion about what healthy weight would be and what cut points might be used. There was a question of if energy requirement is nutrient specific, discuss on how future committees might adapt energy recommendations to be consistent across DRI reviews. And then there was a discussion about whether 2 separate energy equations would be needed, one for normal weight and one for overweight and obese. So those that summary is the first step really in our discussions. And today is an opportunity to move beyond that first discussion. The Energy Committee has a number of questions that they provided to us yesterday, and we'll have further discussion today. The Energy Committee clearly has been at work, and they would like to have input from the Standing Committee on specific questions related to their process. So at this point, I'm going to call on Anna Maria to begin to lead a discussion in this regard. And we'd like to have interaction between the Energy Committee, specifically their questions to us as a standing committee, and then some of our thoughts regarding those questions. We have about a half hour or so for this discussion, and I think we'd like to make sure we cover all the high points and all the questions. We certainly won't have time to resolve things today, or maybe get into a lot of detail. But I want to make sure during this period of time, which is quite short, that we cover all the major questions. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Anna Maria for her to lead the issues of questions for our committee.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank Working Group 1 that, has submitted these questions that really are influencing and are critical to the work of our other working groups within the overall committee. And so I know we've tried to have this discussion last time, and to some degree, we're needing more specificity in the definition of apparently healthy. And in particular, I want the standing committee to think about sort of chronic health conditions that exist in the United States and in Canada at a pretty high level. So for instance, hypertension, diabetes, prediabetes, and maybe elevated cholesterol levels, and whether or not those conditions, if someone is aware of it and actually taking medications, do we consider those individuals apparently healthy? And can we then include both doubly labeled water studies that were done, including those individuals, and or studies that we are going to be using in our scoping of the literature in order to provide our evidence for recommendations on what should be included in the equations? Should studies that include those individuals also be included? So that's one of the questions I think that we would love to be able to open up to discussion. And then I invite my colleagues to sort of dive into that a little bit deeper.
Or thank you for framing that major question. So the floor is open now for thoughts and opinions in that regard. Please, if you raise your hand, and hopefully I'll find you and everybody appears to be shy this morning.
Or we stumped you. I hope we didn't stump you. You can only imagine how we are struggling with some of these questions.
All right, so
I can start off.
Alice,
I
thank
think,
you.
all right, obviously the reason I think everybody's quiet is because it's a really tough question. But, I think part of the issue is, sure, you could control somebody's blood pressure through medication while you're doing the assessment with doubly labeled water, but is that going to be indicative of that group of individuals? Because we know that individuals do not always routinely take their medication. Things change, it has to be adjusted. So even though somebody is theoretically, their blood pressure is controlled, that's not always the case. So it goes back to, do we want to look at, should the issue be the ideal situation or the actual situation?
saw a hand somewhere. Susan.
Yeah, if I could add, we've been told to try and frame these as questions, and so I have to process how to do this. But so that I think the question of medications relates to, especially to changes in energy expenditure across the adult lifespan. Do we want to, include in our consideration of energy requirements individuals who take medications because that's a normal part of aging in reality in the United States, and that to exclude those medications might get an unusual population of older people with consequences for how do energy requirements change with age? Or do we want to define energy requirements across the adult lifespan for people who do not require common medications.
So from my perspective, if you eliminate people taking statins and other medications, baby aspirins, et cetera, you're going to have a relatively small population that you're addressing. I don't know how others feel about that.
Not to mention that a lot of studies don't even ask about those medications when they're collecting information. So that's the other thing I want people to be aware of, that from our review of some of the studies, they're obviously asking for quote unquote healthy individuals coming into their studies, but they haven't necessarily gone into depth in terms of checking all the types of medications that they could be using. So we run the risk of including people with those things anyway, just so that you know.
Is that the case with double labeled water studies? Yes. Oh.
I mean, you've got different kinds of doubly labeled water studies. You've got studies that are relatively low burden, that often don't describe the specifics of the medications, but they say they're generally healthy. And then you've got other studies which are very high burden, and either because they wanted an exceptionally healthy population or because there were risks of some of the procedures. You know, if somebody had high blood pressure, for example, then they would be on a list of exclusions. Treatment for hypercholesterolemia, hypertension, etc.
Well, how does the group feel? Are we trying to include as many people as possible that are without major chronic disease, or are we more interested in only those that are not taking any medications at all?
So John, I see Nadine, Amy, and Alice and Beth having their hands up.
Okay, please go Nadine first.
Yeah, I guess the question is maybe in what way do these conditions affect energy requirement?
It's a very foundational question, I would agree. And it may differ from medication to medication, wouldn't it?
Maybe somebody from the energy committee can talk about, like, if you include people who have hypertension, or how does that have an impact on calorie or energy requirement? Thanks.
Does anybody on the committee currently know the answer to that? I don't know the answer to that, to be honest with you.
I'll just speak because my group has been working in hypertensive patients and hypertension for the last 30 years. As far as we know, the condition itself does not necessarily alter physical activity patterns or energy metabolism directly, but the different classes of medications that some people may take, such as beta blockers, may in fact impact energy metabolism at some level. Our working group has just now identified a couple of systematic reviews around medication and its impact on energy expenditure. We haven't had a chance to review that yet. As far as the other conditions, I can't speak to them directly.
I see Amy has her hand up.
This is a really great discussion, and I understand the difficulty with which you're trying to tread. having a general set of requirements versus highly personalized requirements for broad groups of people. I think some of the discussion we had, and something that to me is very important, is to recognize that less and less of our population meets, a very strict definition of apparently healthy, and that there are demographic factors that are associated with people's health status. And so I personally would like to see the recommendations be applicable to the broadest possible group of Americans.
Thank you. Alice?
That's essentially what I was going to say also. And perhaps there needs to be some distinction that for older adults, I suspect a very, very large percent are going to be on antihypertensive medications and statins. I've never heard or seen anyone suggest that it alters energy requirements, but then again, I'm not sure anyone has looked. But it may be that there needs to be different criterion for different age groups, because so it actually reflects the US and Canadian populations.
All right, thanks. Beth?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking for some clarification. The term apparently healthy population has been used for DRIs for years and years and years. And under that definition, the sodium report included studies on hypertensive, that many of whom are taking medications. Correct me if I'm wrong, Alice, but the lipids report dealt with populations that were hypercholesteremic, including those on medications. So that definition, which has been around for a long time, was not found to be restrictive in terms of including studies on people who were diseased or had diseases that were common or taking medications. So is the concern that that definition is misleading, or is the concern that it's too restrictive, or is the concern we would like to expand it so we can cover more people than have been covered in the past?
I think those are all valid questions.
I think there's also, we're all very aware of the fact that individuals are living longer, and they are living longer with some of these diseases. And so when you're thinking about applying and coming up with a recommendation for most Americans and Canadians, it should be considered. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that as we are talking about the evolution of these recommendations over time, that's something very cognizant to us, because our demographic characteristics of our populations have changed and now include older individuals living with disease.
Janet?
I wanted to say, in terms of comorbidities and defining the healthy population, I think the way it was defined in the sodium and potassium report was primarily in terms of exclusions instead of inclusions. And so I'm just wondering if maybe thinking about comorbidity, just saying, okay, who do we know we should exclude? Obviously, people with metabolic disorders, those types of people are already not included in the definition of the healthy population. But I'm just wondering, instead of thinking about, do people with hypertension on certain medications, should they be included? Maybe we should only be thinking about who do we need to exclude from the healthy population, and then sort of whoever's left over then becomes the healthy population.
That's a good point. Alice?
Well, for those of us that served on the sodium potassium committee, I think at that point, we really didn't know what the healthy population was, and we assumed that eventually more thought would be given to it. So I wouldn't necessarily use that as a reference point, although others on the committee that are present now may disagree with that.
Janet, are you still?
Well, I was just going to respond to that, that there, in addition to the sodium and potassium report, there was some discussion of this in the guiding principles report related to development of the CDRR, which we also had for sodium and potassium, that did talk about including people with obesity and more chronic conditions. So I think that's useful thinking for healthy populations as well. But I guess I was under the impression that the way the healthy population was defined in the sodium and potassium report was fairly consistent with previous DRI reports, as well as the guiding principles report.
True, but I don't think we stepped back and thought, is that the most appropriate definition? I guess that's what I was saying. And I'm not making a judgment as to whether it is or isn't, but it just, I think this is a critical period of time where we need to think about things that have changed, measures that we can make now that we've never been able to make before, and that things have certainly shifted in the population in terms of burden and risk factors, that now's the time to really think about what in the 21st century, how we should really define it.
How do people feel about Janet's suggestion that we more focus on exclusion, who's excluded from healthy population? And I see two hands up, which may be addressing this or something else, versus what's included. I just throw that out. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I think it's a relevant question, which we would like input on as to whether we're talking about inclusions or exclusions. I would also note, I think Alice's point is very relevant. This is a good time to think about this. We published a review last year, and I was really surprised to dig out the statistic that disability years prior to death have increased enormously over the last 20 to 40 years. They've gone up from something like 5 years to 11 years. So, normal people are living in a medicated state with conditions for far longer. That's become, if you like, a more normal part of the aging process. So it's very timely to consider this now as we start a new series of dietary recommendations.
Thank you. Stephanie?
Yeah, I support Janet's proposal. And I don't know when the term apparently was inserted. I think if we go back in both the US and Canada recommendations, it was started out as just healthy, and then somewhere along apparently was put in. So my view is if we define carefully what apparently stands for by the exclusion criteria, and then we're recognizing, excuse me, what Alice said, the state of the demographics at this time. It's just unconscionable to me that we would leave out a huge proportion of those over 65, say, or 60. I don't know what the cutoff is when people start taking medications, but it's getting younger and younger, I suppose. It just doesn't seem appropriate that we can just turn our backs on them. And I think by defining carefully what we mean by apparently, I don't think there could be criticism for that.
So does anyone feel that it's incorrect to go to the exclusion side, defining exclusions? I'd like to hear your opinion if you have it at this point. Nancy?
I think we could probably reword it, so an inclusion and convert it to an exclusion. One thing that we are proposing is to use the International Classification of Diseases. And the latest one out is version 11. And we really did that because the IAEA database, which will be using in addition to the other 3 databases, used it for their exclusion. And I don't know if you're all familiar with it, but I think if you went down the list, we almost all would agree that these are clearly diseases that we don't intend to include. There's a little gray area, and that's what we've been struggling with. There is, of course, metabolic diseases. And I think we got guidance from you all earlier that clearly we didn't want type 2 diabetes, but pre-diabetes would be permissible. So then that raised the question, well, is it pre-diabetes treated by diet or metformin? So then the whole drug question came up. And same in the ICD, hypertension is listed as a disease. So we're trying to be objective and in whatever criteria we take. I don't think it saves, just by going to exclusions, I don't think it avoids the issue. Are we going to accept individuals with medications? And one thing I like what Stephanie said about being apparently healthy, trying to focus on apparent. It could be that someone is stable, as we said, or on medications, but they're perfectly functional. They go to work, they recreate, they're functional in society. Whereas many of the diseases on the list, the individuals are inflicted with these diseases and they're handicapped in some fashion. So that may be one option to really home in on what we mean by apparently, if that person is functional in society. And it's not just the elderly. Obviously, it's primarily the elderly, but you think of in children and pediatrics, what about attention deficit? And clearly we know that those drugs can influence energy expenditure.
Yeah, that's a good point. Susan.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to being as inclusive as possible, because if we do leave out people, let's say with hypertension or with type 2 diabetes for that matter, the question then becomes, what do people who work with those populations do in terms of providing guidance, applying the DRIs? Because if you don't have, if those people are excluded from those recommendations and they're not sort of acutely ill, they're not being managed one-on-one medically, let's say like somebody with end-stage renal disease, obviously their potassium and sodium is being very carefully adjudicated. But if you have a population of people that are generally functional, but are taking medications that aren't having a dramatic impact on their energy needs, then if we exclude them, we just sort of leave them with nothing to go on for what that.
There's Amy.
I would just add to that. I think it's very difficult to exclude a group with prevalence 10% like type 2 but diabetes. So I would like to encourage us to think about a way to include them.
But that probably then forces us to look at exclusion criteria and depending on which drugs they might be on. Similar to a very excellent point about attention deficit drugs. Susan, please.
I was just going to come back to the prevalence of drugs for people over 60. I just checked on the web, 63% of people over 60 take an antihypertensive. So we're talking about very large percentages of the population on these, common medications to prevent NCDs.
Nancy.
Just like one point I want to bring to everyone's attention. We may want to include people with type 2 diabetes and many of the diseases that are on the ICD list. We simply don't have double labeled water on those populations. So I think we have to be cognizant of where the data is available.
Can I ask a little about that? Because it does seem like those doubly labeled water studies have been done in very special very special populations that are not at all generalizable in some sense.
Are you talking about the individuals with disease or in general?
In general, there don't seem to be many, from my understanding, many studies in a general population.
Oh yes, there are.
Okay, so they're and by general population meaning generalizable to the US?
Yes, we're working on getting the Harvard Men's study. Sue can tell you, what's the number, Sue? Over 500 individuals. So there's some very large studies which really drew from the normal healthy population.
But can we cross-tab them with these like what's our sample size if we want to look at people with type 2 diabetes in those generalizable studies, given that that's a condition with, decent prevalence, or do we just not have a lot of data about comorbidities or meds?
We actually tabulated over 800 studies of double labeled water studies. And yes, there are some that are very disease specific, and they tend to be very small studies. So we're just very limited in that area.
Alice.
There are a lot of things that co-vary, and I'm just wondering how much data there are on individuals that are whatever the current term is for normal weight, overweight and obese. Because when you think about people on hypertensive medications, on hypercholesteremic medications, people with metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, a lot of this co-varies, particularly probably in children, but certainly in adults with body weight. So it's unlikely that you're going to have data on a lot of different people and a lot of different medications, but can there be some natural groupings?
Good question. Susan?
Yeah, to come to Amy's question about burden again, Nancy's completely right. We've got a variety of people within the databases, and especially the Harvard Men's Lifestyle Validation Study took a wide variety of people. But at the same time, we've got different levels of studies, if you like. Some of them are relatively low burden. Others of them have incredibly high burden in that database. And so they were necessarily not your average, they were conspicuously not your average person on the street, because they required 100 visits to the research center over 2 years or something like that. So they would be definitely not, normative in any sense. I think that's a consideration that needs to be addressed, whether or not we exclude the studies that have extraordinary study burden, and therefore by just the nature of the physiology being studied in the protocol, they're studying a very restrictive population or not.
Sai.
I agree, and with the inclusion approach and trying to be as inclusive as possible, and using what do we absolutely need to exclude kind of approach. But there's a lot of focus on medications, and that's not the only category or criterion. There are a lot of intake related disorders or issues and conditions, and those need to be considered as well, those that severely affect energy intake. And the other condition or criterion is surgical intervention in those who've had it. So,
Thank you. So since time is moving along here, Anna Maria, I want to turn back to you because you have additional questions and we have some time for more discussion on those questions as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one we were just talking is really sort of the crux of the matter. The other one that our working groups are still trying to understand and need guidance from you all is if you're talking about apparently healthy populations, you know, what BMI cut points are we to use to encompass the healthy population? And then along with that is, do you expect to see separate EER and TEE equations for individual with normal weight or overweight and obese? And specifically within the obese category, are you expecting them to be by class? So, you know, class 1, class 2, or class 3 obesity.
So welcome thoughts on those two questions. Obviously, two more difficult questions. Stephanie?
Well, I think we addressed this the last time, and if we look back at the notes, it was proposed that if the committee can show there's a meaningful difference in energy requirements by body weight, then that would be justified. But so I think if you have data that supports that, but if you don't, then you either put them all in the three classes of obesity into one, if you can differentiate those two. I don't know what information you want beyond that. I thought that was a fairly reasonable approach.
You know, I think the Energy Committee would know better than most of the people on the standing committee where there are differences between the three classes.
Does anybody from Working Group 1 want to elaborate a little bit more in that regard? Because we had talked about using BMI in a continuous format to the degree that the evidence says that that's how we should be approaching this. And so I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit more feedback so that you have clarity moving forward for your work. Nancy, Sue, or Amy? Oh, yes, Nancy, thank you.
Yeah, Stephanie, you're absolutely right. I thought your write-up that you sent back to us was very clear. And that really is our intent. We won't know that until we really get into the analysis, but we certainly will test for differences between the various BMI groups. I think you made it also very clear, despite the limitations of the current cutoffs, we're not to try to redefine them. So we'll stick with the commonly used cutoffs. The one thing, again, there's just going to be very limited data in the class 2 and class 3 obesity. Those are obviously difficult, small scale studies. So I don't think we'd be able to address that specifically.
Yeah. So those are decisions that are best left with you.
Yeah, and we haven't gotten to the analysis yet, but we will.
Thanks a lot, Nancy.
Sure.
Well, is there any other question that the Energy Working Group would like to pose to the Standing Committee now that we're all together? That might have been discussed in the working groups? Okay. I'm not hearing of any other question. So I think, John, you will be awaiting then your letter, if you want to tell us about that process and when we would expect it.
Yes, well, in part, we're going to have another session after a break here to discuss this further, but the letter report will come, will be drafted by the committee, and then it's going to have to go out for review. before being finalized. But this is our opportunity at this point to, give you some advice as best we can, and that's what we're doing now. Anne, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind the both committees that there will be another meeting scheduled, an open meeting scheduled, where the standing committee will have a chance to express its guidance verbally to the DRI committee. We understand that there's a time lag due to our processes in going through, sending a report through review. So we want to give you an opportunity to hear directly from the standing committee with regard to the guidance. That will then be followed by the published letter report that will be sent to the sponsors and made publicly available and shared with your group as well.
Yeah, so, estimated time, perhaps June or so, it might be possible for that. So that's all the more reason to ask any additional questions. We have a few minutes left here. So in general, and these obviously not final conclusions, I'm certainly hearing that including as many people as possible seems to be the prevalent thought here, and also perhaps looking at exclusion criteria rather than inclusion criteria might be the wise action. That, when other DRI committees come together, they may certainly have different exclusion criteria than energy committee. Personally, I'd certainly like to see the international classification of diseases document. I think everybody should, maybe the staff can supply that to everybody. That'd be very useful for us to have as well. So in closure here, I want to remind both committees. Oh, go ahead, Alice.
Well, there's something else I just thought of, and one of the things that struck me, and it sort of was in the back of my mind, is that there is actually a limited amount of data. There is the Harvard study now with over 500 people, but still, when you think about slicing and dicing people, that some people may be on statins and some may be on antihypertensive medications, and some people may be both, and some people may be in the overweight category, and some in the obese category, and some in the normal weight category. And there may be a way of initially grouping, having sort of larger groups, and then seeing whether there's enough statistical power to separate even more. So it may be people that are classified with metabolic syndrome, and then see whether those that do and don't, and then those with metabolic syndromes that are treated with this or treated with that, or have this constellation of factors. It's just something to throw out there. I don't know if it's going to be feasible.
Thanks.
I think to the extent that we have data, in the doubly labeled water databases that we're using to be able to address that we'll be able to do it. So we'll just have to wait and see. And obviously some of it might also then, Alice, come up as a limitation and a request for the next time around to make sure that we have this information that will help guide us and make it more appropriate for coming up with new DRIs for the future.
Yeah, gaps and limitations are going to be very, very important for all reports. Amy?
I was basically going to say that I think it would be very helpful to quantify, where these data gaps are and how they relate to the current composition of the populations we're interested in.
All right, so at this point, I'm going to remind both committees, the standing committee will review and discuss today's questions in closed session. That'll be at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break. Standing committee will then convene a joint meeting again with Energy Committee, as Ann had just mentioned. And then following that, we'll produce a final letter report. But we will have that opportunity to provide you, that is the Energy Committee, with our major recommendations based on your questions. So are there any last thoughts, anything from staff, anything from Anna Maria before we close a little bit early?
Nothing from my end.
So again, thank you all so much. These are difficult questions. And we're going to deliberate some more, as the Energy Committee will do as well. And I appreciate the interchange from everybody and your thoughts. So at this point, we'll close this session, but the Standing Committee will be at the bottom of the hour. We'll reconvene to discuss some of these questions. So thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you. Bye.